Welcome to Myths and Slumber. Tonight, we explore the enchanted realm of Celtic mythology, where ancient Druids whispered secrets beneath sacred oak trees and mystical beings danced between our world and the other world. If ancient myths are your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the ancient stories carry you to sleep. In this timeless place, the boundaries between the mortal and the magical dissolved like dew at sunrise. Here, warriors could step through fairy mounds into realms of eternal youth, where time moved differently and magic flowed as naturally as rivers to the sea. The Celts understood what we have forgotten, that every element of the natural world pulsed with sacred power, and that the stories of gods and heroes were not mere tales, but living truths that shaped the very fabric of existence. Tonight, we journey together into this mystical landscape of Celtic mythology, where the Tuatha De Danann, the divine tribe of the goddess Danu, once walked among mortals as both benefactors and challengers. We will witness the rise and transformation of ancient Ireland, the heroic deeds of warriors whose names still echo in the wind, and the eternal dance between light and shadow that defines the Celtic understanding of life itself. Let the ancient magic settle into your bones now, as we begin this sacred telling of stories that have survived the rise and fall of empires, carrying within them the very soul of a people who saw divinity in every blade of grass and mystery in every twilight hour. Before time had learned to measure itself, before the first stone circle was raised or the first sacred fire kindled, there existed only the vast, primordial waters that held within them all potential, all possibility, all dreams yet to be born. In these cosmic depths dwelt the most ancient of Celtic deities, being so fundamental to existence that their names have become synonymous with the very elements they embodied. From these eternal waters arose Danu, the great mother goddess whose name would echo through countless generations of Celtic mythology. She was not born in the way mortals understand birth, but rather emerged as consciousness itself awakening within the cosmic waters, bringing with her the first stirrings of creation, the first dreams of what could be. Danu was both the river and the flow, both the source and the destination, the divine feminine principle that would nurture and guide all life that was to come. Her consort was the Dagda, whose very name meant the good god, not good in the sense of moral virtue, but good in the way that a perfect tool serves its purpose completely. The Dagda was the earth itself made conscious, the provider, the protector, the one whose great club could slay 9 men with a single blow, and yet whose magic cauldron could feed any number of people without ever emptying. He was the paradox of Celtic divinity, simultaneously the fierce warrior and the nurturing father, destruction and creation dwelling within the same divine frame. Together, Danu and the Dagda began the great work of creation, not through force or command, but through a kind of divine dreaming that slowly took form in the world. Their first children were not human, nor even fully physical, but beings of pure magic and intention who would come to be known as the Tuatha De Danann, the tribe of the goddess Danu. These were the elder gods of the Celtic pantheon, beings who existed in the liminal space between the physical and the spiritual, capable of taking any form they chose, of traveling between worlds as easily as mortals crossed from one field to another. Among the first of these divine children was Brigid, the triple goddess whose aspects encompassed all the arts of civilization. She was the goddess of poetry and inspiration, the divine spark that transformed mere words into magic capable of healing hearts and changing destinies. She was the goddess of smithcraft, her forge fires burning not just metal into tools and weapons, but transforming the raw materials of existence into forms that could serve the growing world. And she was the goddess of healing, her touch capable of mending not just physical wounds, but the deeper injuries of the soul that could plague mortals for lifetimes. Brigid's flame burned eternal in the sacred spaces of the Celtic world, tended by priestesses who understood that this was no ordinary fire, but the very essence of creative force made manifest. When she walked among mortals, which she often did in the early days when the barriers between worlds were gossamer thin, she appeared as a woman whose beauty was not of the flesh but of the spirit. Her presence alone could inspire a poet to create works that would outlive empires, or guide a smith to forge blades that would never dull or break. Nuada of the Silver Arm stood as another pillar of the early Celtic pantheon, the divine king whose authority came not from conquest but from his deep connection to the sovereignty of the land itself. His silver arm, crafted by the gods after his original limb was lost in battle, was more than mere replacement. It was a symbol of the marriage between the natural and the crafted, the organic and the artisanal, that defined Celtic civilization at its height. Through Nuada, the Tuatha De Danann learned the arts of just leadership, understanding that true kingship meant serving as a conduit between the divine will and the needs of the people. But perhaps the most complex and fascinating of these early gods was Lugh, the many-skilled one, whose talents were so numerous and so perfectly developed that when he first approached the great hall of the Tuatha De Danann seeking acceptance, he was initially turned away because every skill he claimed was already represented among the divine assembly. It was only when he demonstrated that he alone possessed all skills perfectly that the gods recognized his unique nature and welcomed him as one of their greatest members. Lugh was the god of light, but not merely the physical light of the sun, he was the light of excellence, of perfection achieved through dedication and divine inspiration. He was master of all crafts, the perfect warrior, the wisest judge, the most skilled musician, the greatest poet. In Lugh, the Celtic understanding of divine perfection found its purest expression, not as an unreachable ideal, but as a living example of what could be achieved when mortal skill was wedded to divine inspiration. These great ones, and many others whose stories interweave like the patterns in Celtic knotwork, established the first age of the mythological world, a time when magic flowed as freely as water and the gods walked openly among the gradually emerging mortal populations. They created the first sacred sites, the stone circles and holy wells that would become focal points for worship and wonder for millennia to come. They established the first laws, not written on stone tablets but woven into the very fabric of reality, governing the relationships between all living things and ensuring that balance would be maintained even as the world grew more complex. In the mists of Celtic memory, Ireland was not always the green jewel of the sea that we know today, but a land that witnessed 5 great invasions, each bringing new peoples, new gods, and new transformations to the sacred landscape. These invasions were not merely historical events, but mythological teachings about the evolution of consciousness itself, the gradual refinement of divine influence in the world through successive ages of increasing complexity and wisdom. The first people to reach the shores of Ireland were led by Caesar, granddaughter of Noah, who arrived 50 days before the great flood that would reshape the world. Theirs was a brief tenancy, lasting only until the waters rose to reclaim the land, but in their short time they established the first human connection to the island, their spirits seeping into the very soil and stones, preparing the way for all who would come after. When the flood waters receded, only Fintan Mac Bachra survived, transformed into a salmon, an eagle, and a hawk in turn, becoming the eternal witness who would preserve the memory of all Ireland's transformations through the ages to come. 300 years passed like a held breath before the second invasion began, led by Partholon and his people. These were the first to truly shape the land, creating the first lakes by their magic, clearing the first plains for habitation, establishing the sacred patterns of human settlement that would endure for millennia. But Partholon's people carried within them the seeds of their own destruction, for they brought with them the first disease, the first plague to touch Irish soil. After ruling the land for 300 years, they were swept away in a single week by a pestilence that left only one survivor, Tuan Mac Carroll, who like Fintan was transformed into various animal shapes to bear witness to the continuing story of the land. 30 years of emptiness followed, during which Ireland rested like a field left fallow, gathering strength for the next wave of change. Then came Nemd and his followers, who proved to be mighty builders and warriors, creating great fortresses and fighting valiantly against the Fomorians, those ancient and terrible beings of chaos who represented the destructive aspects of the natural world. Under Nemd's leadership, the people achieved great victories and established strong settlements, but ultimately they too were overcome, not by plague this time, but by the relentless pressure of the Fomorian forces. Some fled across the seas, while others retreated deep into the earth itself, beginning the long transformation that would eventually bring forth 2 of the most significant peoples in Celtic mythology. Those who fled returned generations later as the Fir Bolg, the Bag Men, so named for the leather bags they had been forced to carry during their years of slavery in foreign lands. These returning exiles had been hardened by suffering and humbled by bondage, and when they reclaimed Ireland they did so with the wisdom of those who had learned the value of the land through its absence. The Fir Bolg divided Ireland into 5 provinces, each with its own sacred centre, establishing the fundamental geographical and spiritual structure that would define Irish consciousness for all time. They were just rulers and skilled warriors, and under their leadership Ireland enjoyed a period of peace and prosperity that seemed as if it might last forever. But the greatest transformation was yet to come, for those who had gone deep into the earth during Nem's time had not been idle. They had traveled to the mystical northern islands of the world, Phaleas, Gorias, Murias, and Findias, where they studied the deepest mysteries of magic and divinity under the tutelage of the greatest sages and druids ever to walk between the worlds. For generations they learned and transformed, shedding their purely human nature and becoming something new, something that partook both of mortality and of the eternal divine essence. When they finally returned to Ireland, they came not as conquerors but as fulfillment of prophecy, the Tuatha De Danann, the divine tribe of the goddess Danu, arriving in clouds of mist and magical darkness that covered the land for 3 days and nights. The Tuatha De Danann brought with them 4 great treasures from their places of learning, each one a symbol of divine authority and power. From Phaleas came the Lea Fáil, the stone of destiny, which would cry out when touched by the true king of Ireland, ensuring that only those blessed with divine sovereignty could rule the land. From Gorias came the spear of Luff, which was so perfectly crafted and so imbued with divine purpose that it never missed its target and could not be turned aside by any armor or magic. From Murias came the Dagda's cauldron, which could feed any number of people and from which none would go away unsatisfied, the ultimate symbol of divine providence and abundance. And from Findias came the sword of Nuada, from which none could escape once it was drawn, representing the perfect balance of justice and power that must guide any true ruler. When the Tuatha De Danann arrived, they sent envoys to the Fir Bolg, offering to share the land in peace, for they recognized the justice and worthiness of those who had ruled Ireland so well. But the pride of kingship and the fear of change led to the first great battle of Maftwired, where the old order would face the new in a conflict that would determine not just who ruled Ireland, but what kind of divine influence would shape the land for all future ages. The battle raged for 4 days, and though both sides fought with valor and skill, the superior magic and divine nature of the Tuatha De Danann gradually won the day. King Nuada himself lost his arm in single combat with the Fir Bolg champion Sreng, and though the divine physicians were able to replace it with one of silver, the injury symbolized that even the gods must sometimes sacrifice perfection in the service of greater justice. In the end, the Fir Bolg were defeated but not destroyed, and many were allowed to remain in Ireland as honored subjects of the new divine kingdom, their wisdom and earthly skills complementing the magical abilities of their new rulers. But even as the Tuatha De Danann celebrated their victory, darker clouds were gathering on the horizon, for the ancient Fomorians, those primordial beings of chaos and destruction, were stirring once again, preparing to challenge the new order with a fury and power that would make the battle against the Fir Bolg seem like a gentle rainfall compared to the hurricane that was about to break upon the shores of Ireland. The establishment of the Tuatha De Danann as rulers of Ireland had not gone unnoticed by the ancient powers that dwelt in the depths of the sea and in the wild, untamed places where chaos still held dominion. The Fomorians, those primordial beings who embodied the destructive aspects of nature, the killing frost, the devastating flood, the earthquake that topples mountains, watched with growing anger as order and beauty spread across the sacred island under divine rule. To them, this transformation represented not progress but a threat to the fundamental wildness that they believed was the true nature of all existence. Chief among the Fomorian lords was Balor of the Poisonous Eye, whose very gaze could kill any living thing it fell upon. Balor was ancient beyond measure, old when the first stars were kindled, and he had watched the slow evolution of the world with growing disdain, seeing in each new development a further departure from the pure chaos that he believed was the only honest state of being. His eye had been poisoned in his youth when he had spied upon Druids brewing a terrible magic, and now that eye, normally kept closed behind massive lids, could lay waste to entire armies when opened in anger. But the conflict between order and chaos, between the divine civilization of the Tuatha De Danann and the primordial wildness of the Fomorians, was not simply a matter of opposition. The two forces were bound together by ancient ties, for some among the gods had taken Fomorian lovers, and some among the Fomorians had children who walked in the light of the divine realm. This interweaving of bloodlines and loyalties would prove crucial in the great war that was about to begin, for the most important figures in the coming conflict carried within themselves both the order of the gods and the wild power of the ancient chaos. Principal among these was Lugh himself, the many-skilled god whose grandfather was none other than Balor of the Poisonous Eye. This lineage was no accident but part of a great prophecy, for it had been foretold that Balor would one day be slain by his own grandson, and the Fomorian lord had tried desperately to prevent this fate by locking his only daughter, Ethniu, away in a tower of crystal on a remote island where no man could reach her. But destiny, like water, finds a way around every obstacle, and through the machinations of fate and the intervention of the Druid Byrog, Ethniu met and loved Cian of the Tuatha De Danann, bearing him 3 sons. 2 of these children Balor discovered and destroyed, but the third was hidden away and raised in secret, growing to become Lugh, the champion who would ultimately fulfill the ancient prophecy. As tensions between the 2 divine races escalated, King Nuada of the Silver Arm found himself in an increasingly difficult position. His injury in the first battle of Math Tuired had been healed through the craftsmanship of the divine physician Dien Sect, who had fashioned a perfect replacement arm from silver that moved and functioned as well as the original. However, the laws of the Tuatha De Danann decreed that no one with a physical blemish could hold the high kingship, and even though the silver arm was a marvel of divine craftsmanship, it still represented a departure from the perfect wholeness that the royal office required. Reluctantly, Nuada stepped aside, and in a decision that would prove nearly catastrophic, the gods chose as their new king Bres, the beautiful son of a Tuatha De Danann mother and a Fomorian father. Bres the Beautiful possessed all the physical perfection that the kingship required, and his mixed heritage seemed to offer the possibility of peace between the 2 divine races. But beauty of form, the gods would learn, does not always reflect beauty of spirit, and Bres proved to be a miserly and oppressive ruler who cared nothing for the welfare of his subjects and everything for his own comfort and glory. Under his rule, the great ones of the Tuatha De Danann were reduced to performing menial labor. The Dagda was forced to build fortresses like a common laborer, Ogma was made to carry firewood, and the divine poets and musicians were denied the respect and support that their arts required to flourish. Even worse, Bres began to give preferential treatment to his Fomorian relatives, allowing them to establish strongholds in Ireland and extract tribute from the native population. The final insult came when the satirist Cairbre visited Bres's court and was offered meager hospitality, dry bread, small beer, and a cold room with no fire. In response, Cairbre composed the first satirical poem ever created in Ireland, a work of such power that it raised blisters on Bres's face, destroying the physical perfection that was his only real claim to kingship. Faced with revolt from his subjects and the loss of his legitimacy, Bres fled to his Fomorian relatives and began to plan a war that would restore him to power and crush the Tuatha De Danann forever. With the threat of war looming, the gods recalled Nuada to the kingship, for Dien Sec's son Mayak had succeeded where his father had fallen short, replacing Nuada's silver arm with one of living flesh that restored the king to perfect wholeness. But even as they prepared for the coming conflict, the Tuatha De Danann realized that they would need a champion whose skills exceeded even those of their greatest warriors, someone who could stand against the terrible powers that Bres was gathering to his banner. It was then that Lugh appeared at the gates of their great hall, the divine youth whose mastery of all skills would prove to be exactly what the gods needed to face their greatest challenge. The armies that gathered on the plain of Math Tuired for the second great battle were unlike anything that had ever been seen in Ireland before. On one side stood the Tuatha De Danann in their divine splendor, their weapons gleaming with inner light, their banners flowing in winds that obeyed their will, their very presence causing the earth to grow green beneath their feet. On the other side came the Fomorians like a tide of destruction, their forms terrible and ever-changing, some appearing as giants with heads of animals, others as writhing masses of tentacles and eyes, and at their head Balor of the Poisonous Eye, his fatal gaze hidden behind lids that required 4 men to lift when the time came for killing. But before the great battle could begin in earnest, single combats were fought between champions of both sides, each victory or defeat shifting the balance of power and determining which force would have the advantage when the armies finally clashed. It was in these preliminary contests that Lugh first demonstrated the extraordinary abilities that had won him acceptance among the gods, defeating Fomorian champions not just through superior strength or speed, but through tactical brilliance and the perfect application of skill to circumstance. His victories were not just military triumphs but artistic performances, each combat a masterwork of strategy and execution that inspired his allies and struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. When the armies finally engaged, the battle that followed was like the collision of fundamental forces, order and chaos meeting in a conflict that shook the very foundations of the world. The earth itself cried out under the weight of divine warriors, mountains trembled, and the seas rose in mighty waves as if responding to the cosmic significance of what was taking place. Heroes fell on both sides, their deaths marking the end of entire lineages and the beginning of new legends that would echo through the ages. At the climax of the battle, Balor of the Poisonous Eye finally opened his terrible gaze, and wherever it fell, warriors of the Tuatha De Danann crumbled to ash and bone. It seemed that all might be lost, that the ancient chaos would triumph over the divine order, when Lugh stepped forward to face his grandfather in single combat. With a perfectly aimed cast of his divine spear, Lugh struck Balor's eye just as it was opening, driving the weapon through the back of the giant's head and slaying the most terrible of the Fomorian lords, fulfilling at last the ancient prophecy and turning the tide of battle decisively in favor of the gods. With the victory over the Fomorians at the Second Battle of Math Tuired, the Tuatha De Danann established themselves not merely as conquerors of Ireland, but as its rightful sovereigns in the deepest spiritual sense. This sovereignty, however, was not simply a matter of political control, but represented a profound mystical relationship between the divine rulers and the living essence of the land itself. In Celtic understanding, the land was not mere territory to be possessed, but a living goddess whose favor must be won and maintained through proper relationship and sacred responsibility. The goddess of sovereignty appeared to worthy kings in many forms, sometimes as a beautiful maiden offering a cup of mead, sometimes as an old crone whose wisdom tested the character of potential rulers, and sometimes as a fierce warrior woman whose strength and independence could only be matched by a truly worthy consort. She was known by many names, Ariu, Bamba, Fodla, Brigid, Maeve, but beneath all these manifestations lay the single truth that Ireland itself was a goddess, and that only those who could form a proper sacred marriage with her essence could truly rule her people. The Dagda, that great father figure among the Tuatha De Danann, exemplified this sacred relationship through his many encounters with sovereignty goddesses. His union with the Morrigan, the triple goddess of war and prophecy, took place at the river Unius on the eve of the great battle against the Fomorians, and through this coupling the Divine Father gained not just the goddess's aid in battle, but her promise that the land would be fertile and the people prosperous under his protection. The Dagda's other unions, with Bone, the goddess of the river Boyne, with Brigid of the sacred flame, with the mysterious figure known only as the Woman of the Sidhe, all represented different aspects of this fundamental truth that divine kingship required not conquest of the feminine principle, but sacred partnership with it. Under the wise rule of the Tuatha De Danann, Ireland was divided into the 5 sacred provinces that would define its spiritual geography for all time to come. Connaught in the west was given to the Dagda himself, that vast territory where the setting sun each day renewed the cycle of death and rebirth that governed all natural processes. Ulster in the north fell under the protection of Nuada of the Silver Arm, the restored king whose perfect justice matched the unchanging character of the northern stars. Leinster in the east was governed by Lugh of the Many Skills, whose light brought inspiration and prosperity to the fertile lands where the sun first touched Ireland each morning. Munster in the south became the domain of Brigid and her sacred fires, the province of craftsmanship and learning where the divine arts flourished under her protection. And at the centre, in the heart of Ireland, lay Meath, the sacred province that belonged to all and to none, the place where the High King held court and where the great festivals brought together people from all the corners of the island. Each of these provinces was marked by sacred sites that served as focal points for the divine energy that the gods channeled into the land. The hill of Tara in Meath became the seat of high kingship, crowned by the Lia Fail, that stone of destiny which would cry out when touched by a true king and remain silent for pretenders and usurpers. Here, the sacred marriage between king and sovereignty goddess was renewed with each new reign, ensuring that the divine connection between ruler and land remained strong and pure. The ceremony itself was a mystery of the deepest sort, involving rituals that had been old when the world was young, transforming a mortal man into a sacred king who carried within himself the responsibility for the welfare of all his people and all the creatures of his domain. Throughout Ireland, the Tuatha Dé Danann established other sacred centers, each one a point where the divine realm touched the mortal world with particular intensity. Newgrange, that magnificent passage tomb that predated even the gods themselves, became a temple to the Dagda and his son Aengus, the young god of love and poetic inspiration whose 4 magical kisses could become birds that carried messages of love to distant hearts. The great stone circles that dotted the landscape were transformed into gathering places where mortals could commune with their divine rulers, participating in festivals and rituals that maintained the proper relationship between all levels of existence. Sacred wells became sites of pilgrimage and healing, each one guarded by a particular deity who would grant boons to those who approached with proper reverence and genuine need. But perhaps most important of all was the establishment of the great festivals that would mark the sacred calendar and ensure that the divine order remained connected to the natural cycles that governed all life. Samhain, the Festival of the Dead, marked the beginning of the Celtic year, the time when the barriers between the worlds grew thin and the ancestors could return to visit their descendants, sharing wisdom and blessings with those who honored their memory properly. Imbolc, sacred to Brigid, celebrated the first stirrings of spring, the return of light and warmth to the world, and the inspiration that would soon bloom in the hearts of poets and craftsmen. Beltane marked the full flowering of spring, the time of fertility and joy when the earth goddess renewed her youth and the sacred fires were lit on every hilltop to celebrate the victory of life over death. And Lugnasad, the festival of Lugh, honored the first harvest and the skills that transformed the raw gifts of nature into the crafted goods that sustained civilization. These festivals were not mere celebrations but sacred obligations, times when the compact between gods and mortals was renewed and strengthened through proper ritual observance. At each festival, offerings were made not in fear or supplication, but in recognition of the reciprocal relationship that bound all things together. The gods provided protection and blessing, the land provided sustenance, and the people provided the honor and reverence that maintained the sacred order. Through these observances, the Tuatha Dé Danann ensured that their rule would be remembered not as a time of oppression or fear, but as a golden age when gods and mortals lived in harmony, when the land was fertile and the people were prosperous, when magic flowed freely and wisdom was available to all who sought it with sincere hearts. Yet even in this golden age, the gods understood that all things must change, that their direct rule over Ireland could not last forever. The mortal races were growing in number and complexity, developing their own cultures and traditions, and the time was approaching when they would need to take responsibility for their own destiny. The Tuatha Dé Danann began to prepare for this transition, not with regret but with the wisdom of those who understand that true love sometimes requires stepping back to allow the beloved to grow and flourish on their own terms. The next great change was coming, and with it would come new challenges and new opportunities for both gods and mortals to discover what they could become when divine wisdom guided human courage toward a shared destiny. The reign of the Tuatha Dé Danann over Ireland, though marked by wisdom, justice, and prosperity, was destined not to last forever in its original form. For in the divine understanding of time and change, every age must give way to the next, and every golden period must plant the seeds of its own transformation. The change that would reshape Ireland came not from within but from across the sea, in the form of a people whose destiny was intertwined with that of the gods themselves, though neither fully understood this connection when their paths first crossed. These were the Milesians, the sons of Mil Spain, whose very name carried within it the echoes of distant lands and ancient wanderings. They were not ordinary mortals, but a people touched by prophecy and guided by visions that had led them across the known world in search of the land that had been promised to their ancestors in dreams and divine revelations. Their journey had taken them through Egypt, where they learned the arts of civilization and the mysteries of divine kingship, through Scythia, where they mastered the skills of war and the crafting of weapons that could channel human will into deadly effectiveness, and through many other lands where they gathered wisdom and power like a river gathering tributaries on its way to the sea. The leader of this destined migration was Ith, uncle to Mil Spain, a man whose wisdom was renowned throughout the ancient world and whose vision could pierce the veils that separated the mortal realm from the domains of gods and spirits. Standing one winter evening on the great tower his people had built in Spain, Ith gazed northward across the dark waters and saw, revealed in a moment of supernatural clarity, the green shores of Ireland gleaming in the distance like an emerald set in silver. What he saw was not just the physical land, but the spiritual reality that lay beneath its earthly appearance. He saw the divine light of the Tuatha De Danann illuminating the sacred island, and he knew with prophetic certainty that this was the land his people had been seeking through all their long years of wandering. Gathering a small company of his wisest and most trusted companions, Ith sailed northward to investigate this vision, leaving behind his nephew and the main body of their people with instructions to follow if his mission proved successful. When they arrived in Ireland, the Milesians found a land of surpassing beauty, more fertile and lovely than any territory they had encountered in all their travels, but they also discovered that their arrival had come at a moment of internal strife among the Tuatha De Danann. The three kings of the divine race, Mac Quill, Mac Sect, and Mac Grain, who had married the three sovereignty goddesses Bamba, Fodla, and Eriu, had died in battle, and their successors were locked in a bitter dispute over who should hold the high kingship of Ireland. The three claimants to the throne, all skilled in war and magic, all legitimate in their ancestry, all convinced of their own righteousness, brought their dispute before Ith, recognizing in the foreign visitor a wisdom and impartiality that their own advisors could not provide. Ith listened carefully to each claimant's arguments, studied the law and precedent that each invoked, and then delivered a judgment that was both just and profound. He counseled them to divide the kingdom equally among themselves, to rule jointly rather than singly, and to remember that the land itself was greater than any individual ruler's ambition. More than this, he spoke of the beauty and richness of Ireland with such eloquence and obvious love that his words themselves became a kind of prophecy, describing not just what the land was but what it could become under wise and caring stewardship. But the very wisdom and nobility of Ith's judgment aroused suspicion among some of the Tuatha De Danann, who began to wonder whether this foreign sage might harbor ambitions of his own regarding Ireland's throne. Their suspicion was fed by jealousy and fear of change, and though Ith had shown nothing but respect for their sovereignty and genuine desire for their welfare, a group of the younger gods decided that he represented a threat that must be eliminated. They attacked Ith treacherously as he was departing Ireland, mortally wounding the wise man and leaving him barely alive when his companions managed to rescue him and carry him back to their ship. Ith survived long enough to reach Spain and tell his nephew Spain of the wonders he had seen in Ireland, but also of the treachery that had befallen him there. His death became the catalyst that transformed what might have been a peaceful migration into a mission of conquest, for the Milesians could not allow such an injustice to go unanswered, and more than this, they now knew beyond doubt that Ireland was indeed the promised land their prophecies had foretold. Spain himself died before the expedition could be organized, but his sons took up the cause, and under the leadership of Eärmon and Eber Finn, the Milesians assembled a great fleet and set sail for Ireland, carrying with them not just weapons and warriors but the accumulated wisdom and power of all the lands they had visited in their long journey to this destiny. When the Milesian fleet appeared on the horizon, the Tuatha De Danann realized immediately that this was no ordinary invasion force, but the fulfillment of ancient prophecies that had long spoken of mortals who would one day challenge divine rule over Ireland. The gods marshaled their greatest magical powers, raising storms and mists to confuse the invaders, sending illusions to make the coastline appear hostile and unwelcoming, and calling upon all the elemental forces at their command to drive the mortals back into the sea. But the Milesians had been guided by their own prophecies and protected by their own magic, and their druid Amergin possessed the knowledge and power needed to counter even the spells of the Tuatha De Danann. The final confrontation between gods and mortals took place not on a battlefield but in the realm of law and precedent, for both sides recognized that this moment was too significant to be decided by mere force of arms. The three queens of the Tuatha De Danann, Bamba, Fodla, and Eriu, who embodied the sovereignty of Ireland itself, each met with the Milesian leaders and extracted promises that their names would be honored in the land forever. Eriu's prophecy proved the most significant, for she foretold that her name would become the principal name of the island, and indeed it is her name, rendered as Éire in Gaelic and Éireann in poetry, that remains Ireland's most sacred designation to this day. The final judgment was rendered by the Milesian druid Amergin, who declared that the Tuatha De Danann should withdraw into the Sidhe, the hollow hills and fairy mounds that dotted the Irish landscape, where they would continue to rule over their own domain while allowing mortal kings to govern the surface world. This arrangement was not an exile but a transformation, a recognition that the age of direct divine rule was ending and the age of cooperation between gods and mortals was beginning. The Tuatha De Danann accepted this judgment with the grace that befitted their divine nature, understanding that this change was part of the greater pattern of cosmic evolution that they themselves had helped to weave. Thus began the age of the Sidhe, when the gods of Ireland withdrew into their hollow hills but did not abandon their connection to the land or their care for its people. They became the Aussie, the people of the fairy mounds, still present, still powerful, still intimately connected to every aspect of Irish life, but now working through influence and inspiration rather than direct command. The mortals took up the burden and the privilege of surface rule, but they did so with the understanding that they were not alone, that the ancient wisdom and power of the gods remained available to guide and protect them as long as they maintained the proper reverence and relationship with the divine realm that lay just beneath the visible world. In the northeastern province of Ulster, where the winds carried the salt spray of distant seas and the hills rolled like sleeping giants beneath skies that changed from blue to grey to gold with the turning of each hour, there arose the greatest of all mortal heroes in Irish legend. His name was Setanta in his youth, but he would come to be known by a name that would echo through the centuries like thunder across the mountains, Cuchulainn, the Hound of Cuillin, whose deeds would inspire warriors for generations and whose tragic fate would teach all who heard his story that even the greatest heroes must bow before the inexorable power of destiny. Cuchulainn was born of both mortal and divine lineage, for his mother Deichtin was sister to King Concobar mac Nessa of Ulster, while his father was none other than Luff of the Long Arm, that god of skill and excellence who had played such a crucial role in the victory over the Fomorians. This divine heritage manifested itself early in the boy's life, for even as a child he displayed strength, speed, and courage far beyond what any mortal should possess. When the battle fury came upon him, his very appearance would transform, one eye would recede deep into his skull while the other would bulge forth like a great red crystal, his hair would stand on end wreathed with sparks and flame, and his entire body would twist and contort until he became a figure of such terrible aspect that even his allies would flee from his presence. The boy earned his famous name through an act of heroism that was also an act of tragic accident, for when he was barely 7 years old, he was traveling to join the boy troop that trained under King Concobar's protection at Emain Macha. Along the way, he stopped at the fortress of Cuillin the Smith, arriving just as the craftsman was releasing his great hound to guard the approaches to his hall. This was no ordinary dog but a creature trained from birth to kill any intruder, massive and fierce beyond description, with jaws that could crush a man's skull and loyalty that knew no bounds save to its master. When the beast attacked young Setanta, the boy was forced to kill it in self-defense, striking it down with his hurley stick and slitter in a feat of strength and skill that left the watching adult speechless with amazement. But even in his moment of triumph, Setanta felt sorrow for the noble creature he had been forced to slay, and when Cuillin lamented the loss of his guardian, the boy offered to take the hound's place, promising to guard the smith's fortress and serve with the same loyalty until a replacement could be found and trained. It was the Druid Cathbad who proclaimed that from that day forward the boy should be known as Cuchulainn, the Hound of Cuillin, and indeed he proved to be a guardian even more faithful and effective than the beast he had replaced. Under the tutelage of the greatest warriors of Ulster, Cuchulainn grew in skill and renown, but his education was completed in a most unusual manner when he journeyed to the land of shadows to study under Scathach, the warrior woman whose knowledge of combat and magic surpassed that of any mortal teacher. Scathach dwelt on an island fortress that could only be reached by crossing a bridge of swords, and she accepted as students only those warriors who could prove themselves worthy through trials that tested not just their physical prowess but their courage, wisdom, and dedication to the warrior's code. From Scathach, Cuchulainn learned the secret techniques that would make him invincible in battle, the salmon leap that could carry him over any obstacle, the thunder blow that could shatter shield and armor alike, and most terrible of all, the Gibalga, the barbed spear that, once it entered an enemy's body, could not be removed except by cutting away all the flesh around it. But it was during his time with Scathach that Cuchulainn also encountered Aoife, the warrior woman's rival and equal in skill, who challenged him to single combat in a battle that shook the very foundations of the Shadow Realm. Their duel lasted from sunrise to sunset, neither able to gain decisive advantage over the other, until Cuchulainn employed a trick that allowed him to overcome his formidable opponent. But victory in battle led to love and peace, and Cuchulainn and Aoife became lovers, their union producing a son who would one day return to Ireland to play a role in his father's tragic destiny. When Cuchulainn returned to Ulster, he found his homeland prosperous and peaceful under the wise rule of King Conchobar, protected by the mighty warriors of the Red Branch and blessed by the presence of noble women whose beauty and wisdom were renowned throughout Ireland. Chief among these was Emer, daughter of Fergal the Wily, whose intelligence and wit matched even her physical beauty, and who would become the great love of Cuchulainn's life after he proved himself worthy of her through trials that tested every aspect of his heroic nature. Their courtship was a match of minds as well as hearts, conducted in riddling speech that demonstrated their mutual wisdom, and their love would endure through all the trials and tragedies that lay ahead. But the greatest test of Cuchulainn's heroism came when Queen Medb of Connaught, that fierce and ambitious ruler whose pride could not endure that Ulster should possess anything that her own province lacked, assembled the greatest army ever seen in Ireland to steal the brown bull of Cooley, whose magnificence rivaled that of her own white-horned bull. This expedition, known as the Tainbua Quailnge or the Cattle Raid of Cooley, became the central epic of the Ulster cycle, a story of heroism and tragedy, of loyalty and betrayal, of the price that must be paid when personal ambition conflicts with honor and justice. The timing of Queen Medb's invasion could not have been more calculated, for she struck during the season when the warriors of Ulster were afflicted by the curse of Macha, a debility that left them weak as women in childbirth whenever they were most needed to defend their homeland. This curse had been laid upon them by the goddess Macha herself, in retribution for the cruelty they had shown her when she was forced to race against the king's horses while heavy with child, dying in victory but not before pronouncing the doom that would make Ulster vulnerable in its hour of greatest need. Only Cuchulainn was exempt from this curse, whether because of his divine parentage or his youth, and so it fell to him alone to stand against the assembled might of all Ireland in defense of his homeland. What followed was the greatest display of single combat ever witnessed in the history of warfare, as Cuchulainn invoked the ancient right of single combat to delay the advancing army while sending word throughout Ulster calling for aid. Day after day, he met the champions that Queen Medb sent against him, and day after day he emerged victorious, though not without cost, for each battle added new wounds to his body and new sorrow to his heart as he was forced to slay men who might have been his friends in other circumstances. His most terrible victory came when he faced Fair Dyad, his foster brother and closest friend from their time training together under Scathach, who had been convinced through trickery and false promises to take up arms against the man he loved best in all the world. In the rolling hills and deep forests of Ireland, during the reign of the High King Cormac Mac Airt, there arose a fellowship of warriors unlike any that had been seen before or would be seen again. These were the Fianna Éireann, the legendary band of heroes who served as guardians of the realm during the summer months, living wild and free in the wilderness, bound together by oaths of loyalty and codes of honor that elevated their brotherhood to something approaching the sacred. They were not merely soldiers but poet-warriors, skilled not only in combat but in the arts of verse and song, able to read the secret language of the wind and trees, to track their quarry across stone and stream, to find sustenance and shelter in the wild places where ordinary men would perish. The greatest of all the Fianna, their leader and the embodiment of all their ideals, was Finn Mac Cumhaill, whose very name has become synonymous with heroic wisdom and just leadership. But Finn's path to greatness was marked from the beginning by tragedy and hardship, for he was born into a world where his family's enemies held power and his very existence was a threat to those who had murdered his father, Cumhaill, the previous leader of the Fianna. His mother, Mourne of the White Neck, was forced to give birth to him in secret and then surrender him to the care of others, for there were those who would kill an infant to prevent him from growing up to claim his rightful inheritance. Finn was raised in the wilderness by two women warriors, Bodmal the Druid and Liath Luachra the Grey One of Luchar, who taught him the skills he would need not only to survive but to excel in a world where strength and cunning were required in equal measure. From them he learned the art of silent movement through forest and field, the ability to read weather and season in the flight of birds and the behavior of beasts, the knowledge of which plants could heal and which could kill, and above all, the warrior's code that would govern his conduct throughout his long and eventful life. But perhaps most importantly, they taught him that true strength came not from the ability to dominate others but from the wisdom to know when to fight and when to forbear, when to speak and when to remain silent, when to lead and when to follow. The first great test of Finn's destiny came when he sought out the poet Finneses, who had been waiting by the river Boyne for 7 years to catch the salmon of knowledge, the magical fish that contained within its flesh all the wisdom of the world. Finneses had received a prophecy that one named Finn would catch this salmon, and assuming that he himself was the Finn referred to, he had devoted his life to this quest. When the salmon was finally caught, the old poet entrusted its cooking to his young student, warning him not to taste even the smallest portion of its flesh, for the first to taste it would gain all its knowledge and power. But as Finn turned the fish over the fire, hot fat spattered onto his thumb, and instinctively he thrust the burned digit into his mouth to ease the pain, thus becoming the first to taste the salmon of knowledge and gaining in that instant the gift of prophetic wisdom that would guide him through all his adventures. Armed with this supernatural insight, Finn made his way to the Hill of Allen, where the High King Con of the 100 Battles held court, arriving just as the court was being terrorized by Aelin mac Midgna, a malevolent being from the city who came every Samhain to burn down the royal hall with his magical fire-breathing. No warrior had been able to stay awake to fight the creature, for Aelin's music had the power to lull all hearers into enchanted sleep, leaving them helpless when the supernatural flames came. But Finn, guided by his newfound wisdom, pressed the point of his spear against his forehead whenever he felt the drowsiness coming upon him, using pain to overcome the magical sleep, and when Aelin arrived to work his destruction, the young hero was ready with a magical cloak that could quench even supernatural fire. In the battle that followed, Finn not only defeated the monster but won recognition from the High King, who restored to him his father's position as leader of the Fianna and began the heroic career that would make his name immortal. Under Finn's leadership, the Fianna became more than a military organization, they evolved into a brotherhood dedicated to the highest ideals of Celtic warrior culture. To join their ranks, a candidate had to pass tests that examined not only physical prowess but intellectual ability, poetic skill, and moral character. He had to survive pursuit by armed warriors while carrying only a shield and a head start of 1 tree's length, and if a single braid of his hair was disturbed, a twig broken beneath his feet, or his weapons trembled in his hands, he was rejected. He had to leap over a stick held at the height of his brow while running at full speed, pass under another held at the level of his knee without slowing, and draw a thorn from his foot while maintaining his pace, demonstrating the perfect control of body and mind that the warrior's life required. But beyond these physical trials, he had to prove his knowledge of poetry and law, his understanding of the Druidic wisdom that guided Celtic society, and his commitment to the code of honor that placed protection of the innocent above personal gain, truth above convenience, and the welfare of Ireland above any lesser loyalty. The adventures of Finn and his companions became the stuff of legend, tales told around fires throughout Ireland of heroic deeds performed in service of justice and honor. There was Oisin, Finn's son, whose name meant Little Fawn but whose prowess in battle and beauty of verse made him renowned throughout the land, and whose love for Niamh of the golden hair would lead him on a journey to Tir na Nog, the land of eternal youth, that became one of the most beautiful and tragic love stories in all of Celtic literature. There was Diarmuid of the Love Spot, marked by the gods with a beauty that no woman could resist, whose tragic love affair with Grain, betrothed to the aging Finn, would test the bonds of friendship and honor that held the Fianna together. There was Cailt mac Ronayne, the swift-footed messenger whose speed was legendary and whose memory preserved countless stories and poems of the heroic age, and Conan mac Morna, the satirist whose sharp tongue and quick wit provided comic relief but also served to deflate pretension and remind even the greatest heroes of their humanity. One of the most significant of all the Fianna's adventures was their encounter with the god Manannan mac Lyre, the sea god who ruled over the Islands of the Blessed and who appeared to them in the guise of a mysterious warrior seeking their aid in a quest that would take them beyond the boundaries of the mortal world. This journey led them through realms where the laws of nature operated differently, where time flowed like honey and space folded upon itself like silk, where they encountered beings of pure magic and faced challenges that tested not just their courage but their understanding of reality itself. Through these adventures, the Fianna learned that their role as guardians of Ireland extended beyond protection from mortal enemies to defense against supernatural threats that could emerge from the otherworld at any time. But perhaps the most profound of Finn's adventures was his pursuit of the goddess of wisdom, who appeared to him in dreams and visions, always just beyond reach, always leading him deeper into the mysteries of existence. This quest took him to the edges of the known world and beyond, to places where the very concepts of past and future lost their meaning and where he encountered truths so fundamental that they could only be expressed in the language of poetry and symbol. Through these experiences, Finn grew from a simple warrior into something approaching a sage, his understanding deepened by exposure to the cosmic forces that shaped all existence, his wisdom tempered by the knowledge that even the greatest heroes must eventually face the limits of their own mortality. As the years passed and the members of the Fianna aged, their adventures became fewer but more meaningful, each one carrying greater weight as they approached the end of their heroic age. The fellowship that had seemed eternal began to show signs of strain, and conflicts that had been suppressed by shared purpose and mutual respect began to surface, foreshadowing the tragic events that would eventually lead to the Fianna's dissolution and the end of the heroic age itself. But their legacy would endure, preserved in the countless stories and songs that celebrated their deeds, inspiring future generations with examples of courage, honor, and the pursuit of excellence that transcended the mere accumulation of wealth or power. In the misty valleys and soaring mountains of Wales, where the ancient Celtic spirit found refuge from the changing world and preserved itself in stories that would outlive kingdoms and empires, there flourished a collection of tales that captured the very essence of Celtic imagination and wisdom. These stories, gathered together in what would come to be known as the Mabinogion, represented the fullest flowering of Welsh mythological tradition, weaving together themes of sovereignty and sacrifice, love and loss, magic and transformation that spoke to the deepest levels of human experience. At their heart lay the four branches, interconnected tales that chronicled the adventures of divine and semi-divine beings whose struggles and triumphs reflected the eternal patterns that govern both individual destiny and the fate of nations. The first branch tells the tale of Pwyll, Prince of Dyfed, whose encounter with Arawn, King of Anne, the Welsh Otherworld, set in motion a series of events that would demonstrate the power of honor and friendship to transcend even the boundaries between life and death. Pwyll's story began with a moment of poor judgment, when he drove away Arawn's hounds from a stag they had fairly brought down and set his own pack upon it, violating the ancient laws of courtesy that governed relations between nobles. But when Arawn appeared to claim satisfaction for this insult, he proposed not combat but an exchange of identities, asking Pwyll to spend a year and a day ruling and while Arawn took his place in the mortal world, with the understanding that at the year's end Pwyll would fight a battle against Arawn's enemy Halfdan, whom the King of Anne could not defeat due to a mysterious curse. This exchange became a test of character that revealed the true nobility of both kings, for each ruled the other's realm with such wisdom and justice that their subjects barely noticed the substitution, and when they met again at the year's end, they had forged a friendship that would endure through all challenges. Pwyll's victory over Halfdan, achieved by striking only the single blow required by the laws of single combat rather than the multiple strikes that would have restored his enemy to life, demonstrated the wisdom he had gained through his otherworldly experience and earned him the title Pwyll Pen and Pwyll Head of Anne, acknowledging his status as a friend and ally of the otherworld. But Pwyll's greatest adventure came through his courtship of Rhiannon, the mysterious lady whose beauty and nobility marked her as no ordinary mortal woman, though her true nature remained hidden until their wedding day revealed that she was a goddess of sovereignty whose choice of consort would determine the spiritual character of his reign. Their courtship was marked by challenges and tests, for Rhiannon's beauty had attracted many suitors, including Gwalab Clud, whose persistent pursuit forced her to employ her divine wisdom to escape an unwanted marriage through a clever stratagem that turned her suitor's own greed against him. When Rhiannon finally wed Pwyll, their union represented more than a simple marriage but a sacred alliance between the mortal realm and the otherworld that would bring blessings to Dyfed for as long as their love endured. The second branch continues the saga with the story of Branwen, daughter of Llyr, whose tragic tale demonstrates how even the most well-intentioned actions can lead to sorrow when pride and misunderstanding poison the relationships between peoples. Branwen was given in marriage to Madhalwick, King of Ireland, as part of a diplomatic alliance designed to bring peace between the Welsh and Irish realms, and initially the match seemed blessed, producing a son who would inherit both kingdoms and unite them in perpetual friendship. But the marriage feast was marred by the actions of Efnisien, Branwen's half-brother, whose jealousy at not being consulted about the alliance led him to mutilate Madhalwicka's horses in an act of spite that created a diplomatic crisis threatening to destroy the very peace the marriage was meant to secure. though the immediate crisis was resolved through the generous compensation offered by Branwen's brother Bran the Blessed, including the gift of a magical cauldron that could restore life to the dead. The seeds of future conflict had been planted, and when Matholwick returned to Ireland, his nobles' resentment at the perceived insults he had endured led them to demand that he take revenge upon his Welsh wife. Branwen, who had done nothing to deserve such treatment, was reduced to the status of a servant, forced to work in the kitchens and endure daily blows from the palace butcher, while her son was taken from her and raised to hate his Welsh heritage. For 3 years she suffered in silence, until she trained a starling to carry a message to her brother Bran, informing him of her plight and begging for rescue from her intolerable situation. The war that followed was one of the most terrible conflicts in Celtic mythology, as Bran led the Welsh across the Irish Sea to rescue his sister, wading through the waters himself since no ship could carry his enormous bulk. The battles that ensued devastated both kingdoms, with the Irish relying on their magical cauldron to restore their fallen warriors to life, while the Welsh fought with the desperate courage of those seeking to rescue one of their own from injustice. The conflict might have continued indefinitely, with the cauldron making the Irish forces effectively immortal, until Efnisien, whose thoughtless actions had begun the whole tragic sequence, redeemed himself through heroic sacrifice, hiding among the Irish dead and then destroying the cauldron from within at the cost of his own life. The third branch tells of the trials of Manawydan, Branwen's surviving brother, who returned from the Irish War to find his own kingdom transformed by supernatural forces that had emptied the land of all life save himself and the family of Pryderi, Pwyll and Rhiannon's son. This enchantment, cast by enemies seeking revenge for past injuries, created a kind of waking nightmare in which the familiar landscapes of Wales became empty and desolate, populated only by strange apparitions and magical creatures that defied all attempts to understand or combat them. Manawydan's response to this crisis demonstrated the Celtic ideal of wisdom combined with persistence, as he refused to abandon his responsibilities despite the supernatural nature of the threat, instead applying practical intelligence and unwavering determination to discover the source of the enchantment and find a way to break it. The solution came through Manawydan's recognition that the supernatural events followed certain patterns, and by careful observation and clever manipulation of these patterns, he was able to identify and ultimately confront Llwyd ab Sil Coed, the magician responsible for the curse. The confrontation revealed that the enchantment was punishment for an ancient wrong committed by Pwyll against Llwyd's friend Gwalab Clud, demonstrating how actions have consequences that can extend far beyond their immediate effects and affect generations yet unborn. Only through negotiation and mutual understanding was the curse finally lifted, restoring life to the land and teaching all involved that justice must sometimes be tempered with mercy if the cycles of revenge and retribution are ever to be broken. The fourth branch culminates the entire cycle with the story of Math Fab Mathenwy and his nephew Gwydion, whose mastery of magic was so great that they could transform the very nature of reality through the power of their will and wisdom. But their greatest creation was also their greatest tragedy, for when Gwydion's brother Gylfaethwy desired Gawain, the virgin who served as Math's footholder and whose purity was necessary for the old king's magical power, Gwydion devised an elaborate scheme involving the theft of magical swine from the otherworld that led to war and ultimately allowed his brother to achieve his desire through rape. The punishment that Math inflicted upon the two brothers was both just and instructive, transforming them into a series of animal pairs, deer, swine, and wolves, forcing them to experience life from perspectives radically different from their own and to understand the consequences of their actions in the most visceral possible way. When their punishment was complete and they had learned the lessons Math intended, the old magician set them a task of creation rather than destruction, charging them with creating a wife for Llywelyn Gifs, Math's nephew, who had been cursed by his mother Arianrhod never to have a human wife. From the flowers of oak, broom, and meadowsweet they fashioned Bloated, the flower face, whose beauty was beyond description but whose nature, rooted in the wild and untamed aspects of the natural world, would ultimately lead to tragedy when she betrayed her husband for love of another man. The tale of Llew's death and resurrection, his transformation into an eagle and eventual restoration to human form, became one of the most powerful mythological symbols in Celtic tradition, representing the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that governs all existence. These four branches, when taken together, present a complete vision of Celtic understanding about the nature of existence, the relationships between different levels of reality, and the patterns of cause and effect that connect all actions and their consequences across time and space. They demonstrate that heroism consists not merely of physical courage but of moral wisdom, that true power lies not in the ability to dominate others but in the wisdom to understand the deeper patterns of existence, and that the greatest magic is that which serves justice and promotes harmony between all the different forces that shape the world. Through these stories, the ancient Celtic spirit continues to speak across the centuries, offering wisdom and inspiration to all who have ears to hear and hearts to understand the eternal truths they contain. Feel yourself carried gently back across the centuries, but carry with you the gifts that these stories offer, the understanding that courage and wisdom must walk hand in hand, that the greatest magic lies in right relationship with all living things, and that even the mightiest heroes must sometimes yield to forces greater than themselves. The Tuatha De Danann have not vanished but withdrawn. If you're still awake, subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments, which myth or legend should we explore next? Sweet dreams.